Depression is as old as human history. The Bible has many examples of people who struggled with depression, despondency, and despair. Hello, my name is Dr. Carolyn T. Long, and I am a therapist, minister, author, and consultant. And I want to talk to you briefly about depression and the Christian. Examples of Bible characters who suffered depression were Elijah. He experienced depression and fatigue and asked for his life to be taken. Number 2, Jonah felt deeply despondent after God did not destroy Nineveh. Thirdly, Jeremiah regretted the day that he was born. Job's wife asked him to curse God and die in the midst of all of his suffering and pain. Well-known church leaders such as Martin Luther, John Bunyan, Charles Spurgeon, J.B. Phillips struggled with depression, as well as political leaders such as Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln also suffered depression. So you can see that depression is not a respecter of persons. It is called the common cold of emotional or mental health disorders. It is one of the most prevalent mental health disorders, but it is also one of the most treatable. It affects approximately 20% of the population during one's lifetime. Job, whose story is found in the book that is named for him, was a perfect and an upright man who eschewed or stayed away from evil. So the tragic things that happened to Job did not happen to him because he had done anything wrong. He had not sinned. Job suffered great loss because the scripture tells us that God was the one that said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Not only did God allow Job to go through the pain and suffering that he went through, but it was God's idea. In your leisure time or when it's convenient for you, I would really encourage you to pick up and read the book of Job in its entirety and read about the loss of his children, the loss of his livestock, the loss of all his possessions, but also the suffering that he went through in his physical body. I would encourage you to do that. But what I want to do now is to highlight for you the grief reaction that he experienced, which also mimicked a major depressive disorder. His friends came to mourn with him and to comfort him. When they had heard about his tragic events, they sat for 7 days in silence. But then after day 7, Job broke the silence. And when Job broke the silence, he cursed the day of his birth. He cursed his conception. He wondered why he was not stillborn. He wanted to know why he did not die in infancy. He asked, why was life given to the bitter of soul? He made it very clear that he was in misery and that he was longing for death. As a matter of fact, he had a preoccupation with death. He goes on to say that I'm not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes. And this is in verse 25 and 26 of chapter 1. And then he goes on to say, what he is saying there is that he is also experiencing anxiety. And we know that anxiety oftentimes accompanies depression. What I've shared so far with you takes place in the first 3 chapters of Job. In chapter 6, Job openly shares how depressed and angry and upset he is about what is happening to him. And then he goes on to continue this through chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 9, and chapter 10. In chapter 6, Job experiences, he calls heavy grief. He has a heavy heart and he feels victimized by God. He also experiences an eating disturbance because he loses his appetite. Food has lost all meaning to him, and he longs for death. Number 2, he is suicidal. He is wanting to die. He said, "Oh, that I might have my requests, that it would please God to crush me." Verse 9, chapter 6. He has low self-esteem. He feels like a failure. He loses his energy. One of the symptoms of depression is just tiredness, a loss of energy. And in verse 11, he says, "I feel like I have no strength." In verses 14 through 15, he feels rejected by his friends. He feels that they should give him a little sympathy, yet they're only giving him criticism. In verse 11, he's hopeless. He says, "What is my strength that I should hope?" Which says his hope is gone. In verse 24, he is seeking and he's asking God, "Why? Why have you allowed this to happen to me?" And also in verse 17 through 21, he becomes even more blunt in his questioning of God. Now, he didn't sin. God said several times in the book of Job that Job did not sin, because I know I grew up with the information that I could not question God. But that's not true, because he said so clearly in Isaiah 1:18. He says, "Come, let us reason together." And so this is what Job is doing. He is reasoning with God. He is trying to get an understanding of why God has allowed him to suffer this way. And then in verse 29 of chapter 6, he says, "My righteousness still stands." In other words, he is saying, I know I haven't sinned, yet he does not understand why this is happening to him, which also suggests that now he is suffering some confusion. In chapter 7, starting at verse 2 and 4, we see that he has a sleep disturbance. He talks about wearisome nights, lying awake, tossing and turning. He says, "While I lie down, I say, when shall I arise, and the night be gone? And I am full of tossing to and fro until the dawning of day." Sleep disturbance is certainly one major symptom of a major depression. Job goes on to say that he is continuing to feel hopeless and there is a lack of fruitfulness. He says, "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and are spent without hope." He's getting nothing accomplished. That's another symptom of depression. In verse 7, there's negative talk. He says, "My eyes will never see good again." That's negative talk. We see that so much among people who are feeling depressed. And then in verse 11, he speaks again about the anguish and the bitterness of his soul. He says that my soul is in anguish. He says, "I will complain in the bitterness of my soul." In other words, he's angry and he's complaining. And that is common for someone who is experiencing depression. Then in verse 14, he's experiencing nightmares. He says, "Then thou scareth me with dreams and terrifies me through visions." So not only is he having sleeplessness, but he's also having nightmares. Verse 15, he is loathing of life. The word loathe means to hate or to dislike or to have a disgust for life. Again, he has lost all appetite for life and he is longing for death. Again, verse 15, again, he talks about deadness of soul. He says, "My soul is dead." Verse 16, social withdrawal. You know, when someone is depressed, many times they just want to go into their homes and close the door or get in the bed and get under the covers and not want to deal with anyone about anything. Well, would you believe that that's what Job said to God? He said to God, "Leave me alone." Then in chapter 9, he got to the point that he could not receive from God. That's often the case when I get people into my office who are depressed. They are quite disturbed by the fact that what Job says is that if he goes by, I do not see him. He says if he moves past, I do not perceive him. And so many times when a person is depressed, they feel so disconnected from God, and that makes them even more depressed. Then in verse 21, he talks again about his confusion. He says, I'm blameless. In other words, I haven't done anything wrong, yet I am being treated in this manner. Job goes on to say that even if I am righteous, now he's getting to the point that he's not sure anymore if he's actually righteous with all this happening to him. He says, even if I am righteous, I cannot lift my head. What's happening now is that he is feeling disgraced. He is feeling shame because of what he's going through. And that's what happens so much of the time with Christians, is that they are depressed, they are going through, but they feel ashamed and disgraced because they feel that they should be at a different place. Then lastly, in verses 18 through 20, we see again the social withdrawal. He is very upset with God, and he is pouting like a little child. And for the second time, he says to God, leave me alone. Well, if you or someone you know has experienced a severe grief reaction or a major depressive disorder, such as Job has experienced, then you know exactly what Job is talking about. You know what it feels like to have the sleepless nights and the sadness and the maybe not wanting to live and the questions about why I'm going through what I'm going through, knowing that you cannot find any reason or you cannot find any reason for this happening to you. My role as a counselor is to help people become aware of their anger and their feelings, and especially their anger toward God, because many people are not as open as Job is about expressing their anger to God. They feel that maybe God will just come and slap them dead if they tell God that they're angry with them. Well, did you know that God already knows that you're angry with him, even if you don't verbalize it out of your mouth? Remember, I said that he said, and you can read for yourself, God said twice in the book of Job that Job did not sin. So, in Job's expressing his anger and confusion and questioning of God, if that was not considered sin for Job, then it certainly also would not be considered sin for you. As an overall way of looking at Job's situation, you might think that if God allowed a righteous man like Job to have the experiences that he had, then he might also allow you to go through some depression, some despondency, or some despair. The experience of Job answers two questions very clearly. Number one, is all depression a result of sin? Obviously, the answer is no. There certainly may be some cases of depression that may be related to sin, but in this case, his was not related to sin. The second question is, was God punishing Job for anything? The answer to that question is also no. Remember, God was the one that said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And God said twice in that book, in the first 3 chapters, that he is an upright man and he stays away from evil. So we know that God was not punishing him for anything because he had done nothing wrong. So in this case, however, the depression experience of Job is neither related to anything that he did wrong or to any sin that he committed. Maybe you're a Christian and maybe you're sitting out there and you're listening to this video and you've been feeling depressed and anxious, maybe even some of the feelings that Job has gone through, but you have felt too embarrassed or too ashamed to get help. Maybe you think that it suggests that you're weak or that your faith is not strong enough, or maybe you're wondering if I've done something wrong to be going through what I'm going through. Now that you've heard about Job, hopefully you will be willing to accept that if you are suffering from some depression, that you would be willing to get help. I'm also speaking to the pastors and to the church leaders out there to say and to remind that depression is no respecter of persons. And so there may be from time to time men and women, children and adolescents in your church body who may be suffering from depression and who need to be encouraged to get the help that they need, along with the spiritual counsel that you may be providing for them. We cannot live the abundant life that Jesus came to give us if we are suffering from depression and despair. So get the help that you need so that you can be everything that God ordained for you to be. Thank you for listening to this video. And if there is a way that we can serve you, please contact us at the information listed on the screen. And again, thanks for listening.